Thank you, Session Chair, for the introduction. So good afternoon, distinguished guests. My presentation here today is focused on the Express Pearl response. Okay, the Express Pearl response was an incident in which OSRL committed many man-days to support, approximately 868 man-days to be more exact. And our involvement in the response spanned a period of over 9 months. This presentation is, however, not just about the incident response, but specifically focused on the use of online tools and mobile applications to support the visualization of the shoreline cleanup and assessment technique, or SCAT, process. So I know Richard just gave us a very good presentation just now, already covering this incident, so I won't talk too much about the overview of the incident, but what we really need to know is a container vessel caught fire and ran aground and sank, and ultimately the pollutant of concern was not the oil, but the plastic nurdles, which ended up becoming the focus of the response. And OSRL, as I mentioned, we were mobilized on the 26th of May, 2021, under the BIMCO ResponseCon contract, and we spent a lot of time there, and we were finally demobilized only this year on the 15th of March. So just some photographs from the early days of the incident. I believe Richard had already covered this earlier, so I won't add much more comment over there. Just to quickly talk about some of the challenges of a nurdle response or a plastic response. They are really small particles, less than 5 millimeters in diameter, and you can imagine that there were about 1,680 tons worth of nurdle on board the Express Pearl, and so you can just imagine the sheer number of these tiny particles that were, of these tiny pellets that were released into the environment and ended up washing up upon the shore of Sri Lanka. Another challenge notable is that I'm sure that we all can appreciate the fact that the nurdles do not dissipate into the environment. They are very persistent. They will persist basically in our lifetimes, and they will not disappear into the environment. Unlike how we may expect oil, even persistent oil, we may expect oil to eventually dissipate into the environment. This meant that obviously a no response option was out of the question, so we had to do something about it. Coupled with the fact that tidal movements every day, the waves coming in and out, and of course tidal movements near shore caused continual remobilization of stranded nurdles on the shoreline, and you can imagine that they would be redeposited onto fresh areas of shoreline, maybe areas that were already cleaned, or maybe even new areas which have not been contaminated before. So this created challenges. A clean beach could not be declared clean, basically, because of the fact of remobilization and redeposition of nurdle pollution along the shoreline. So this also created issues with endpoint determination. And of course, another challenge was the high degree of background human-generated waste, which the responders had to go through as well. So we're interested in the nurdles, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that we have to sieve through to try and get it. So there's some photographs there, typical scenes that we were encountering in country. Buried nurdles, which was already mentioned before, as nurdles get washed up onto shoreline, sometimes they get buried under sand, which also gets washed up and redeposited along the shoreline. So digging for buried nurdles was part of the response as well. Some other challenges, burnt nurdles. The nurdles got burned. When they get burnt, not only do they turn black, they also become brittle. So there were genuine concerns about the fact that these burnt plastics were very brittle, and they were basically degrading into particles smaller than your naked eye can see, and basically microplastics which gets mixed into the environment. That was a challenge that we had to deal with as well. And questions of toxicity, because the incident happened alongside H&S substances on board the vessel, and the fact that the nurdles got burnt as well. There was a question of the toxicity of the nurdles, and this caused the nurdles to be declared as hazardous waste during the response. And this had implications on the way the response was carried out. And of course, responding during COVID-19. The first few rotations of responders were working under a biosecure bubble arrangement, which was quite restrictive in terms of movement and in terms of interactions outside our own circle of people. And of course, COVID-19 restrictions were gradually eased as Sri Lanka also eventually opened up, keen to restart their tourism industry. Some pictures about the response. I won't talk too much about them because Richard has already given us a good overview of the incident. But basically, a lot of sieving of sand separating the nurdles, which were of larger diameter than the finer sand that could be found along most of the beach. Burnt nurdles sometimes washed up on the shoreline in large chunks, as you can see on the top right hand there, and could be picked up by people by hand. Some of the mechanical equipment that was being used, beach cleaners, commercially available beach cleaners on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side is a purpose-built trommel, which was custom built by a local engineering company, basically just to ease the process of filtering the nurdles. Now talking about data gathering. So what about monitoring the progress and effectiveness of the work being done on site each day? Information was also gathered utilizing a purpose-built survey done on a mobile platform. A form such as what we see here was completed for each day's work, with key pieces of information being the weight of recovered nurdles on site. So in every response, there is an importance to be able to gain situational awareness about the environment in which the response is taking place. So the uniqueness of a nurdle response, as mentioned in the previous slides, meant that the standard oil spill survey forms that we were used to had to be adapted to suit the nature of the response. Information such as which area was surveyed, what is the extent of nurdle pollution, whether or not there were buried nurdles, and any other information which would support the deploying of a cleanup workforce. So you're not meant to be able to see the details on the screen here, but these are basically snippets of the survey that were being used at the time via mobile phone platform. Using this online tool meant that the survey could be done in a highly consistent yet scalable manner, and the data could be readily available on an online web portal every day for a user to appreciate. So what about the progress and effectiveness of the work being done on each site each day? So this information was also gathered utilizing a purpose-built survey, separate to the one that I was showing earlier, also done on a mobile platform. So what you see here is information being captured with key pieces of information, such as the weight of the nurdles being recovered on site. So with all that data that we were gathering every day, we can imagine how the amount of data can quickly pile up and overwhelm the user if not properly presented. This shows the concentration of where the data points were being collected over the span of the response. We will not truly appreciate the scale of the number of data sets just by looking at the image, but there were over 1,605 data submissions, and this was just during the tenure that OSRL was in country. So the key question quickly became, how do we make sense of all of this data, and how do we present it in a way which we can make some sense of it and understand what it's all about? What can we build a bigger picture from all the data that we are seeing from the field? So the answer during the time of the response was an online dashboard. The GIS dashboard is an existing feature of the ArcGIS online tools, which allow a user to customize the presentation of data based on the individual requirements. So some of these key information was the classification of the shoreline by segments, trends of nurdle waste collected each day, or the site yield, trends of how much nurdle was collected per worker per day or per hour, so the productivity of a worker deployed at each site. And all of this information was of interest to us because eventually we were thinking about how to guide the formation of an endpoint for the cleanup. So in a conventional response, endpoints are one of the first pieces of criteria that is established when pursuing a shoreline cleanup. But however, due to the complexities of a nurdle recovery, this became a point which was much more challenging to establish. Thus, it was a desire to establish data points to monitor so as to be able to make a justification of how clean is clean when the time comes, and basically to give an evidence of the progress of your cleanup operation. Here is an example of one of the dashboards produced. The surveys produced can be viewed as a list, as what we can see on the left, or by geographical location, as what we can see on the maps on the right. Each dot on the map represents a survey, which is color-coded to show the concentration of reported nodal pollution. So low is expressed in a green dot, medium in an amber, and red, high contamination in a red dot. On the bottom, we can also view the number of surveys performed within the location shown on the map each day. And a time filter can also be used to express the data how we wish to view it. Here is the same dashboard showing more data. By toggling the dates in which the data was submitted, we may be able to monitor if the reported concentrations of nodal pollution are being reduced as time goes by. Indicatively, by looking at the graph at the bottom of the dashboard, we may observe if there are any downward trends in the number of reported nodal concentrations on the beaches. So that was the dashboard covering the survey data. What about the daily progress report data for the on-site cleanup, which we were also collecting every day? So this dashboard shows the yield in terms of weight of nodals collected for each of the work sites each day. On the left-hand side is a leaderboard showing the shoreline segments which produce the highest yields, filtered based on the map area showing on the right. There are even a few bits of nerdy or geeky information for those who are interested, such as the standard deviation, mean, etc. And what about the yield over time? This view gives us an indication for a particular chosen segment of shoreline where we can track the values of reported nodal recovery for each day the site was worked. Unfortunately, with the data collected at the time, there was not a clear downward trend yet, as you can see from the graphs. There was not a clear downward trend yet in terms of site yields to indicate that the pollution is being removed conclusively. This highlights the challenge of a nodal recovery response, aforementioned, and the very nature for it to be protracted. Just quickly talking about some other visualization functions which were also employed. I mentioned shoreline segmentation earlier. This was an exercise also done via online tools. So the first step in segmentation was done via an online snipping tool in which we imagined the shoreline as a long piece of string, which we snipped into the various segments based on the observable geographical features utilizing the principles of SCAT. This would be followed up by on-site verification whereby responders would decide whether or not the segmented shoreline needed to be sub-segmented. Segmentation was particularly useful as it allowed all responders to keep awareness of exactly which segment of the shoreline they were working at each day, as the information was readily accessible via mobile phone. So this was an actual exercise that I was involved in during the response. Another useful application that was employed during the response was to track where we were digging. So I mentioned about how we were digging for buried nodals earlier. So there was a plan to dig up a certain beach based on surveys that were being done, and it became necessary to monitor where we had already dug versus where we were going to dig next. So this was another example of how we could use online tools to actually help that, using the GPS function on our phones to actually manage this process, rather than trying to stick, for example, a stake into the ground. And then you run the risk of maybe local community workers just stealing your stakes out of the ground, or the stakes just getting washed away by weather, inclement weather, for example. So this was a helpful tool as well.
So Matthew, if you could just through.
This is my last slide. Thank you. Finally, in closing, some reflections about the response. Firstly, the Express Pearl response demonstrated how the principles of shoreline cleanup and workforce management can be applicable to non-oil pollutant scenario as well. We were very pleased to be able to contribute to a response outside of our more common area of focus, which is oil spills. And secondly, as was the point of this presentation, The ArcGIS tools and dashboard functions was a good demonstration of their usefulness. Beyond that of a plastic response, in other words, there may be potential for applications in the future, oil spill response as well. And this is an area which we hope to be able to take forward into the future. So finally, in closing, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. And I would just like to leave with some acknowledgements, firstly to the staff of the Marine Environment Protection Agency of Sri Lanka and the government and community workers of Sri Lanka who are really doing a really good job and working very hard on the response based on my experience there. And also the many colleagues from ITOF who we had the privilege of working very closely with during the response as well. So thank you very much.
Oil Spill India 2022 is dedicated to the Honorable Prime Minister's Swachh Bharat Abhiyan and Clean Seas.